So I'm looking forward to hearing more about my hometown of Chinquapin. Kenan Maready.
Hey, that's welcoming.
I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak to you, but you'll soon learn I am not a polished speaker. Very few people from Mill Swamp are polished speakers.
You're not in a polished crowd.
We weren't good speakers. We knew how to raise tobacco, or at least we used to. I don't think they do that anymore. And chickens and pigs, and some people were reputed to have skills in moonshining. I don't know. You might know that. I was born in if you've read my book, one of my books, I was born in a two-room house. There was a kitchen, and we had two beds in that kitchen, and there was a bedroom, and we had two beds in that bedroom. We had no plumbing, no electricity. We had no air conditioning except for the broken windows without any screens in them, and many of you all probably grew up the same way I did. But I think it's pretty fortunate that we grew up that way. We learned how to take care of ourselves, look out for ourselves. I never knew the government would help you. I don't think the government did help people back then. There were no social services that I ever heard about. So, and as you heard, I went to work for S.H. Kress when I finished school. I didn't want to go to Long Island, New York, and I felt cut out to be a manager of a dime store. So I decided to join the Air Force. The recruiter told me I would learn a great skill in the Air Force that would allow me to get a good job. I was looking forward to learning something. Maybe I could be a radio repairman or something. Instead, they taught me Morse Code. That is not a skill that's in big demand when you get out of the Air Force. Does anybody here know Morse Code? Okay, Sonny, I'm going to spell a word in. All right, listen up. Dotty da dit, diddy da dit, da dit, da dit, da da di da, diddy da, di da, di da da dit, di dit, da dit. What was that?
It's nice to be in Rose Hill today.
No, that was Chinquapin in Morse Code. I was in Anchorage, Alaska. What we did was, eavesdrop or intercept Russian military messages where they were moving their troops, their airplanes, and so on. I was in the Air Force Security Service. And in order to save a little more money, I signed up for isolated duty. It was a little island out in the middle of the Bering Sea, a lot closer to Russia. It was about the size of Rose Hill probably altogether, no trees. The wind blew about 60, 70 miles an hour, a lot of snow. But anyway, I earned $50 a month more by being out there. And when I got out, I had saved $600. You'd think I could have saved more than that, but I had an allotment out for my mother, and they took half my pay so that she could get a monthly check. So anyway, forgive me for using notes. I get off track if I don't use notes. I went to Wake Forest, as Vinny said. I've had a very, very fortunate life. I've done a lot of traveling, been to Europe a couple of times, been out west, all over the United States, and so on. But I've really learned there's no place like home, I think, right? And I learned that Europeans talk differently than we do, especially in England. They speak the same language, but they use words that don't mean the same thing. When we say bird, we know what we mean. When they say bird, they mean a woman. When we say braces, we talk about things that kids put on their teeth. They're talking about suspenders. It seems like I've heard that, but that's not it. When we say trolley, we're talking about the things, transportation. They're talking about a grocery store shopping cart. When we say dummy, we say an idiot. And I don't know how they get this, but they're talking about a baby's pacifier. I don't understand that. We say football, they mean soccer. And when we say restroom, they call that a water closet or a WC. You ever heard of a WC? Let me read you a little story about the WC. A proper English lady and her husband planned to take a tour in a rented travel trailer of some of the southern states. She had studied a brochure online about a camp in southern Georgia where they could park their travel trailer for a night or two. After studying the brochure, she didn't see if any restroom facilities were available, so she sent an email to the camp manager and asked if the camp had a WC. The manager didn't know what a WC was, so he conferred with the staff. They all agreed the lady was referring to a wayside chapel, WC. So he sent the following email to the English lady. Dear Madam, I take great pleasure in informing you that the WC is situated only 9 miles from the camp. In the center of a beautiful grove of pine trees surrounded by lovely grounds. I'm sorry, I get... It is capable of holding about 229 people and is only open on Sunday and Thursday. As there are a great number of people who are expected during the summer months, I would suggest that you come early, although as a rule there's plenty of standing room. You will be no doubt glad to hear that a good number of people bring their lunch and make a day of it. I would especially recommend that your ladyship go on Thursday where there is musical accompaniment. It may interest you to know that my daughter was married in the WC. And it was there that she met her husband. I can't remember the rush there was for seats. There were 10 people to a seat ordinarily occupied by one. It was wonderful to see the expression on their faces. The newest attraction is a bell donated by a wealthy resident of the district. It rings every time a person enters. I shall be delighted to reserve the best seat for you if you wish, where you will be seen by all. That's the story of the WC. How did I come to publish a book? Several years ago, I had 5 brothers and sisters, 6 of us. And that was 8 of us living in a 2-room house. That was pretty crowded. I asked them to write down 3 stories about things they remembered growing up in Mill Swamp, and they did. And the next Christmas, we always get together back years ago for Christmas, and we'd share those stories, read them, laugh, cry, and really had a lot of fun. So we did that for 2 or 3 more Christmases. Every Christmas, we'd write 3 or 4 stories, put them together. I put them together in a notebook, just the way they had written them down, and gave them a copy, and gave a copy to my 2 children. Then it occurred to me maybe other people may be interested in reading those old stories, because a lot of people grew up the same way we did. So I did that, and decided maybe I can get that book published. I had no idea how to go about getting a book published. But I went online, did some research, and found a company called Create Space. They don't charge you anything. You put everything in your computer the way you want it, upload it to their website, and they don't print out an inventory of books. If they get an order, they'll print 1 book and mail it. If they get an order for 10 books, they'll print 10 books and mail it. They're a subsidiary of Amazon.com, I think. So it didn't cost me a thing to get this book published. So, and since then, it's amazing how many people have told me they live just like I did, pretty much. Into the back of hogs, farming, swimming in the creeks and the swamps, as we call them. Halso Swamp, Coal Swamp, and in places like that. Had little charge accounts at the corner stores, Elmer Maready's store, probably Mr. Ent Whaley's store. Everybody had a charge account there. Same thing, Valentine's Day, Easter egg hunts at school, Christmas programs at church, and so on. But the one thing that was most important, how many of you all remember going collar stealing? A few Pelleys, I'm sure, and Terry. Yeah. That was a big night for kids. January 6th, which used to be way back, it's called Old Christmas, because before they changed the calendar from the Gregorian or to the Julian or vice versa, January 6th was Christmas. And so I don't know how college stealing got started, but that was a big thing in Mill Swamp. You can go online and Google college stealing, and 2 or 3 choices will come up, and somebody has written some things about members of college stealing. So, let me read you a little story about my first college stealing night. It was bitterly cold on my first college stealing night, but the excitement and the running helped keep the cold at bay. It was a cloudless and moonless night. Due to the absence of any outside lights in Mill Swamp, the stars were so bright it was almost like staring at the sun when I looked at them. Millions and millions of stars and planets could be seen. The Milky Way glowed all across the sky. The Big Dipper and the Little Dipper were sticking out like a sore thumb. The northern lights looked as if they were dancing and flashing across the sky right over Chinquapin. Do any of y'all ever remember seeing the northern lights? Am I the only one? Terry saw it. Okay. Anyway, don't see them anymore, I don't think. As Joan, that was my sister, who was 2 years older than I was. As Joan and I left our house to join our group, I asked her, "Don't you think that with all those stars and planets, some of them have somebody on at least one of them stealing collars tonight?" I've heard or read that some people believe there are people living on other planets. Joan looked up at the sky and replied, "Maybe, but I don't believe they'll be stealing collards." Sudie, that was our older sister, Eloise's age, I think. Sudie told me that collards only grow in the South. I think they're probably stealing turnips or rutabagas or maybe even peanuts. They may be so different from us, they might like things we don't. They may be stealing kudzu or poison ivy, for all I know. We'll ask Sudie what she thinks. She knows everything. Another question came to me. You know, a long time ago, tonight was Christmas night, the night Jesus was born. Who did God send to those other planets to save them from their sins? Jesus was God's only son. Do you think he sent an angel, or maybe he had a daughter and sent her? What do you think? A puzzled look came across John's face. Gosh, I don't know. You ought to ask Mr. Rufus, your Sunday school teacher. I used the wrong name. That was really Mr. Roscoe Henderson I was talking about. I don't know if any of you remember working at Mr. Luther Lanier's store. Yeah. I didn't have any success with that book, never made the New York Times bestseller, so I decided to try it again. This time I wrote a book called Chinquapin, All It's Cracked Up to Be, and I'm not the main character in that. There's a boy 3 years older than I am. He was the son of this school janitor at Chinquapin, and I'm not going to tell you his name because I don't want him to hear that I wrote a story about it. I changed his name in the book and changed the color of his hair from red to black, and anyway, he had failed 3 grades, and he ended up in my class. I think he was 3 years older than everybody else in that ring. I'd like to read you a little story about, his name was Carrie Les Moore. The Presbyterian Church in Chinquapin always put on a reenactment of the birth of Jesus on the Saturday evening before Christmas. This year, all of the participants were to be children. As I was pretty good at singing, the preacher asked me to be one of the 3 wise men. We would come in from the outside at the right moment and sing, "We Three Kings of Orient are," as we walked down the aisle to the stage. We had one practice before the play, and we got our mothers to make a robe. The little girl, Annie Bostick, will be playing the piano. This is the preacher talking to me. Who will be playing the piano for us that night. She's kind of young, but she's been practicing for about a month and is pretty good. The rehearsal went okay. Annie was surprised when she saw that I was going to be one of the wise men, and she was even more surprised when she heard me sing. She had never heard me before. She looked at me in a different way. Jeff and Jay Allen weren't much help. Mostly they just moved their lips and let me do the singing. The night of the play was very cold as the 3 wise men waited outside for their cue from Miss Effer Pickett. Some of you may remember teaching school at Chinquapin. Waiting for Miss Effer Pickett to come in. While we were waiting, just the 3 of us, Jeff pulled a plug of tobacco from his back pocket and offered me and Jay Allen to chew. I had never tried chewing tobacco before, although I had smoked cigarettes. I don't think J. Allen had either. As nobody was watching and we had a few minutes, we all took a bite out of the plug. It tasted awful, and after a couple of minutes, my mouth was full of tobacco juice. What do I do with this juice? I asked Jeff. Before he could answer, Miss Effer stuck her head out the door and motioned for us to come in. Our entrance came a lot sooner than we thought. We hesitated for a minute, but Miss Effer was adamant that we needed to come in now. We walked in with our wise men robes and our mouths full of chewing tobacco and tobacco juice. It proved difficult to sing without letting some of the juice drip from our mouths. Jeff seemed to be able to handle his okay. I think he swallowed some, but J. Allen and I were novices. The audience was surprised to see and hear the three wise men singing badly and dripping tobacco juice as they walked up the aisle. Andy turned around to see what was going on. At the rehearsal, we had sounded much better. I don't think she was impressed with me when she saw the tobacco juice running down my chin and dripping onto my wise man robe. When we presented our gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh to the baby Jesus, we were careful not to drip tobacco juice on the swaddling clothes. That book didn't sell very well either. While I was doing some research, I came across down at the library in Wilmington some old newspapers, which are on microfilm. And I saw there were a lot of columns written in those days by ladies in different communities around. They would submit their little column to the paper maybe once a week or every other week, where they told about who was visiting who was in the hospital, who had children, whose anniversary, who was married, who went to Raleigh to shop, and so on. And so I copied all those articles and put them in a book called Duplin County Goings On. That hasn't sold at all. I thought people would be interested, but apparently not. Let me read you two or three little articles that give you an idea. This was December 21st, 1953. If you remember any of these names, raise your hand. You probably won't. This is from Warsaw, maybe if some of you know. Miss Mary Lee Jones of Warsaw became the bride of Norman Whitford Jones Wednesday afternoon, December 21st, in the Warsaw Baptist Church, with Dr. Alden W. Greenlaw officiating. Nobody heard of that, right? Okay, some of you have heard of these names. October 28, 1953, Chinquapin. Mr. and Mrs. Woodrow Maready and family were some of those who were attending the state fair. Also attending were Mr. and Mrs. Butler Cavanaugh and Mr. and Mrs. Rudolph Futrell, as well as J.T. Easter, Donald Lanier, Red Bradham, and Frank Futrell. Now, isn't that interesting news? Minnie, did you go to Beulah School?
Me?
Yeah. Oh, you did? Well, you won't remember. Anyway, they also had scores of ball games. This is December 8, 1953, Beulahville. Beulahville and Rose Hill split a pair of basketball games tonight in Beulahville. The Beulahville boys winning 72-62, with the Rose Hill Lasses taking the opener, 44-41. I don't think they'd use the word lassie anymore. That'd be politically incorrect, I'm sure. High scores for the Beulahville boys were Dobson with 23 and Jason with 11. Rose Hill's quintet was sparked by Russell with 12, Wells with 10, and Murray with 13. I used to know a CPA here. His name was Horace Murray. I wonder if that was him. Elwin Murray, that's right. Yeah, Elwin Murray. There was a Horace Murray CPA in Wilmington. I got them mixed up. Okay, here's kind of an interesting article. This is about the March of Dimes in Duplin County in 1956. Duplin County's March of Dimes contribution for 1956 is the largest ever given in this county. This report came today from George Penny. Anybody remember George Penny? County chairman. He revealed that $6,313 had been turned in. Prior to the 1956 campaign, the largest solicitation for Duplin for the March of Dimes was around $4,800, which was in 1955. A breakdown of the contributions from the several communities is as follows. Wallace apparently was the richest, $2,829. That's about a third of the whole amount. Warsaw, $553. Potter's Hill, $25. Very poor community apparently. Kenansville, $361. Serecta, $16. Northeast, $150. Facing, $366. And here's one I never heard. Cabin. Does anybody know where a cabin is? You do? All right. I didn't know. $130. Beulahville, only $52. Albertson or Albertson, I don't know how you say it, $287. Cedar Fort, $52. Didn't your mother move to Cedar Fort or Terry or something? Did you ever live in Cedar Fort? No? Okay.
I'm there.
Oh, yeah.
The March of Dimes at that time, wasn't that money used for the polio?
Polio, yeah. Polio was a dreaded disease back then, right? Chinquapin, $35. We were very poor. Magnolia, not much better, $38. Lyman beat Chinquapin, $52. Teachie, poor Teachie, $15. And Calypso, $175. That's the way money was brought in. Anybody know Mr. Tom Sanderson in Chinquapin?
Yes.
Built that Hula Drive-In Theater about 1948 or something. We all wonder, why did he name his theater Hula? We didn't think Miss Ethel ever did the hula, but we just didn't know. He came up with some reason. And they had a walk-in. If you didn't drive in your car, you could walk in and sit down. And I always, my memory was called the chicken house, and Terry corrected me and said, no, it was the dog house. Yeah. And little boys from Chinquapin, they'd go up and wash the dirt off the windshields because they're all dirt roads. And if you did that, they would, Mr. Tom, Mr. Ethel would let you in free. So there was a lot of competition for that job. Mr. Tom Sanderson's mother, Miss Eula Sanderson, she was born back in 1883 and died in 1906, I think. And I got a copy recently of a conversation that between her and her daughter. Some of you may remember Miss Vida Sanderson Malloy.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. She's the one who wrote some of those columns that ended up in the paper. So this was a conversation, and she wrote it down, and I got a copy of it. And I was going to read a few little things to kind of remind you of how things were in those days. Chinquapin, known as Scuffletown. You ever remember ever hearing of Scuffletown? I always thought it was due to all the beer joints and people were fighting and all, but she said it came from people probably having to scuffle for food and other commodities of life for existence. When the first U.S. Post Office was established around the 1870s, it had to have a respectable name. A delicious nut called Chinquapin grew here in the woods, and I've eaten some of those, probably you have. Not knowing the origin of its name, it was decided to call the town Chinquapin, and has been called it ever since. And here's just some little brief things she mentioned. I've left a lot of it out. She's talking about Tom Batts. Was that your brother? No. Tom Batts was a smart farmer. He wore ragged clothes. One small boy asked him once or said, "Mr. Tom, you've got the raggedest breeches I've ever seen." Mr. Batts told him that was his Sunday pair. W.H. Sloan, General Merchandise, had a cotton gin, a grist mill, turpentine still, and first post office where mail was brought out every Friday from Magnolia by horse or mule. I don't know anything about that. Why would mail come from Magnolia?
The railroad.
Train? Oh, okay. Yeah. I was beginning to doubt Miss Eula, but now I know. Mr. and Mrs. George Bradham had two children. One of them was Caleb. Did y'all know anything about Caleb Bradham?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. They invented the Pepsi-Cola. She said he attended college, studied medicine, but wound up making our own Pepsi-Cola we enjoy so much today in Newbern, North Carolina. His whereabouts are now unknown. Does anybody know what happened to Caleb? He disappeared, according to Miss Eula. Old man Blaney Burton was said to have sold whiskey in the neighborhood. It seemed when it would be getting real low in his keg, he would add a lot of water so he could have some the next day. Job Thigpen and wife Becky Sutherland attended to a turpentine still, had two boys, Tom and Jerry, who paced the road most of the time, looked for nothing to do. Mr. Buck Parker, father of the late G.B.D. Parker, ran a general store in which his son, G.B.D., carried it on in a big way for many years, and the store is still in business. I'm sure a lot of you remember the G.B.D. Parker store. Yeah? Josh Cottle, father of Henry Lark Bogg. Boy, he had some strange names to this one. Lark Bogg, Sarah, Maggie, Franny, and Finney was a blacksmith. Bellows were used to heat torches, to melt iron, using flint rubbing together to alight into flame. Many people would come and get fire to start in their homes when matches were scarcely existent, scarce as hen's teeth. Once he hired a rail splitter, an Irishman, and he went out and gathered all the rails he could and split them into splinters, rails that were already into the fences. He didn't get good directions, I guess. People cooked in and on an open fire with big fireplaces then. They banked hot coals at night. The doctors here were Dr. Tate, Dr. Hatcher, and the late Dr. Frank Landon, son of old Jim Landon, a farmer and school teacher. His son Frank would walk to Wallace to attend school, finally to college. Now, Dr. Frank Landon is the one who sewed up my arm here when I cut it at about 2 years old. Really badly, the artery was cut, and Daddy rushed me to Dr. Landon's office, and he sewed me up. Dr. Landon's son, George Frank, was my 8th grade teacher at Chinquapin and was later the principal, I believe, after I moved to Chinquapin. Okay. Mr. Seaburn Castine and Mrs. Civil Hubbard were the only ones known to have received Yankee Civil War checks. Don't know how unless they were Benedict Arnolds in one manner or the other. Now, Mr. Seaburn Castine was my great-grandfather. And he did serve in the Confederate Army for a while, but he must have seen how the war was going, so he walked over to Newbern and joined the Northern Army. So I always wondered how he was received when he came back home. And apparently not very well. She called him the Benedict Arnolds. And I can understand that. Many people were employed as blacksmiths where they made the barrels, tar pits, and the turpin were housed into, loaded on rafts, which was a group of logs on the river, large enough to haul it. Men and supplies to last them for several days to Burgall in Wilmington. My maternal grandfather, William Nelson Castine, told me that he did that. They'd cut the logs, kind of bind them all together and float all the way down the Northeast River to Wilmington. The first tobacco barns built around 1900. First automobile owned by Mr. G.B.D. Parker. The first radio brought from New York City by Tom Sanderson. The first rural mail was carried by horse or mule and cart. Hallsville and Chinquapin probably had rural service simultaneously about. I don't know what that means. Here's something I didn't know. About the first church was built by the Catholics near the old Blaney Burton place around 1880. Father Gross and Father Price, Father Gibson are remembered to have held mass and services for a time. I didn't know there were any Catholics anywhere. Has any of you ever heard of a Catholic church around here? I'd never heard of it. But I'm sure she was right in that. Most people walked to church. The ladies were very careful, walked barefoot almost to church, then sit by the roadside and put their shoes on again. The Reverend Jim Cavanaugh preached there, also a Reverend Mr. Rice Carroll, who was about the tallest man they had ever seen, which was better as all could see and hear him. Once the preacher was preaching away on about what each one would do if Gabriel should blow his trumpet. He said that Christians wouldn't budge an inch. One of the elder members was very nervous, but kept her feet shaking and swaying to and fro. Another elderly lady was vigorously fanning herself. Her shaking her foot got to causing the floor to shimmer without her knowing it. Finally, the whole church floor began to tremble. The preacher's face whitened. The group looked around, sad-faced. The lady with the fan got up and remarked, "It's too damn hot in here for me," and walked out where the preacher followed her, then the whole congregation, thinking it was an earthquake. As you know, church was very important in those days. That was the social life as well as the religious life. Everybody went to church. And sometimes the preacher would be asked to eat with a family, or sometimes the preacher may just drop in. And in my book, Chinquapin, all it's cracked up to be, this is what happened to the hero's story. He dropped in and sort of invited himself to eat with us. And Ma said to me, "Carrie Les, will you say the blessing for us?" I almost panicked. "Why don't you say it, Ma? After all, it was your hands that cooked the food." "No, I'd rather you say it. You can show Mr. Garvin," some of you remember Mr. Garvin, "you can show Mr. Garvin how much you've learned in Sunday school and church." I felt trapped with no way out. I knew we ought to have a blessing of the food since our preacher was eating with us, and it looked like neither Ma or Pa would do it. I gave in. I want every head bowed and every eye closed. That's what all the evangelists said when they prayed. "Lord, here we have Mr. Garvin and we ourselves. We are like sheep eating in your pasture, and thank you for the 99 what stayed home. Where they go, I'll go. Thank you for all the heathen so that Christians will have something to work with. Thank you for the poor who always be with us. Forgive us our passes as we forgive those who pass us. And Lord, please help Pa get over his love of money. May your will and mine be done. Thank you for the hands that cooked our food. Amen." We all opened our eyes except Mr. Garvin, who kept looking down at his plate for a moment before raising his head. Ma said, "I think that was a mighty nice prayer, Carrie Les. Don't you think so, Mr. Garvin?" Mr. Garvin thought for a moment and then asked, "Isn't Miss Effa Pickett your Sunday school teacher? I need to have a talk with her." I assumed he wanted to tell her what a good job she was doing in teaching me all about the Bible. What's the matter with my time? Am I running out of time? Okay. I came across some minutes of the Sharon Baptist Church way back in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s, and downloaded them in my computer and condensed them quite a bit. It was kind of interesting. They were really concerned about people's behavior back then. You could get kicked out of a church for very little. I want to read a few of these little. These are from business meetings of the Sharon Baptist Church. September 5th, 1910. Sophronia Wood was excluded from this church, she having joined the holiness people. September 16th, 1916. B.W. Parker was elected as a committee to see Brother Marcus Handley as to his whereabouts and attitude toward the church. Sam Register was appointed as a committee to see Fanny Register as to her conduct. B.W. Parker, John Wood, and E.P. Blanchard were appointed as a committee to see Brother J.L. Cottle as to his attitude toward the church. March 25th, 1917, Sister Mabel Quinn was dismissed of account of departure from faith. June 24th, 1917, Brother R.W. Sloan was excluded from the church on account of inconsistent Christian living. I don't know what that meant. June 18th, 1922, Joe Bradham was excluded from the church. E.P. Blanchard, H.J. Batts, Ed Cottle, and Percy Moretti, one of my distant cousins, were appointed by motion as a committee to report any wrongdoings among the members. So they went out in the neighborhood and kept up with it. Actually, I don't have it in here, but my mother was suspended from the church for dancing, I think. And here's a March 20th, 1926. By motion, Percy Moretti, Jacob Castine, that was one of my great uncles, and Roscoe Pierce were appointed to deal with members for dancing. May 12, 1926, it was moved and seconded to appoint a committee to see Johnny Parker for cursing and getting drunk. It was moved that Percy Moretti and Luther Lanier see Ben Bass as to being drunk and dancing. Dancing was really forbidden back in those days. June 19, 1926, Bob Wood and Ed Cottle were appointed as a committee to see Johnny Parker as to getting drunk and report at the next conference. The next meeting took place on May 21st, 1933, just as the Depression was getting started. And apparently the church was having a bad time financially speaking. Sunday, May 21st, 1933, a motion was made to pay the pastor up at our next regular meeting and inform him that we're unable to pay him for further services and ask him to resign. That was a pretty bad time, wasn't it? The motion passed. And here's, I don't understand this. A motion was made and passed to ask every member to pay at least the price of a dozen eggs on the death of Mrs. White. Apparently the church owed Mrs. White something. I don't know how a dozen eggs cost back then, but not very much, I guess. That was what was going on at the Sheridan Baptist Church. Somehow I have missed, oh, here's something. Back then we didn't go to doctors or dentists unless it was a real emergency. You just didn't do it. You stayed at home and did the home remedies. And I want to read some of the home remedies. If you ever participated in these, raise your hand. Baldness or thinning hair. 1, you can smear your head with fresh cow manure. Or 2, you could, if you had thinning hair, make a solution of salt and water and comb through hair every day until you see hair becoming thicker. Okay? Bee stings. Mix up honey and dirt. They say dauber. I always say dauber nest. Mix up honey and dirt dauber's nest and rub it on the sting. If you had to prevent a cold, eat an onion sandwich and wash your hair. I don't get this too. If you had colic, close the windows and doors of the baby's room and have the father keep smoking a pipe or cigar. That would really help. You had a cough. You did not want to get a cough and have this remedy applied. Put some cow dung in water and bring it to a boil. Gargle the water 3 times a day and your cough will be gone. You may be too. Or you could bake onions and pour all the juice from the baked onions into a glass and drink. And here's a good one, I'm sure all of you remember this. If you had a crick, I call it a crank, I think, or something. Crick in the neck. Go down to the hog pen and find where a hog has rubbed his neck against the fence. Then rub your neck in the same spot. If you had a cut, and I wish Dr. George Frank Landon had read this before he sewed me up. Take a large army ant and apply him to the cut so that he takes hold of each side of the wound with his pincers. Cut his head off from his body, leaving his head to hold the cut together. If you had lice, how many of you had lice? Nobody's going to raise around. First, put your clothes on an anthill, then wash your head in kerosene. Sprinkle your head with sea salt, and then, parting the hair, pour raw whiskey on your scalp. Let it stay for 48 hours. Do not smoke or go near the fire. Here's a good one for ringworms. Is ground itch, that's not the same as ringworms, is it?
Yeah.
It is?
Yeah.
I had ground itch a lot.
Yeah.
Go barefooted and wade through those ditches and all that. And actually, I used to drink from those ditches. You know, if you saw water running, it was clear, you're out thirsty, you just lap it up like a dog. I think that's why I'm in such good health. Became resistant to disease. Ringworms. Find a black-headed girl between the ages of 12 and 16 and have her remove her right shoe. Now rub her big toe well over the ringworm for about 1 minute. Within a week, the ringworm will have disappeared. I don't know. Now here's a good one for stuttering. We had a guy who stuttered in our community, Jesse Davis. Some of you probably remember Jesse Davis. Owen Davis or something. Hit the person stuttering in the mouth with a chicken gizzard. Chicken gizzard. Whooping cough. Put some hair from the person on a piece of bread outside the kitchen door where the moon can shine on it. If a dog comes along and eats it, the cough will be cured in 5 days. Or you could put place a pan of fresh chicken droppings under the bed. Then there was an asterisk under this and said, don't try these at home. Yeah, it's time. We'll be ready to go. I did another little book not long ago. I had saved over the years some funny things that I saw online and decided to put them in a book. They're really funny to me. And I called it, Is Laughter the Best Medicine, I think. And there's different categories of things. Some of you all probably have heard these before. I'm going to read you 3 or 4. These are errors in church bulletins, worship order service. 1, this being Easter Sunday, we will ask Mrs. Lewis to come forward and lay an egg on the altar. This is another one. The service will close with little drops of water. One of the ladies will start quietly and the rest of the congregation will join in. 3, a missionary from Africa, Mrs. Bertha Belch, will speak tonight. Come tonight and hear Bertha Belch all the way from Africa. Classified ads. For sale by owner, complete set of Encyclopedia Britannica, 45 volumes, excellent condition, $1,000 the best offer, no longer needed. Got married last weekend, wife knows everything. 2, nice parachute, never opened, used once, slightly stained. There's some good country music song titles. If you don't leave me alone, I'll go and find someone else who will. My wife ran off with my best friend, and I sure do miss him. Some couple of newspaper headlines. Grandmother of 8 makes hole-in-one. Calf born to farmer with 2 heads. Some children's letters to God. Dear God, I read the Bible. What does begat mean? Nobody will tell me. Dear God, is it true my father won't get in heaven if he uses his goth words in the house?
Yeah.
Some Bible stories told by children. Lot's wife was a pillar of salt during the day, but a ball of fire during the night. Solomon, one of David's sons, had 300 wives and 700 porcupines. St. Paul cavorted to Christianity. He preached holy acrimony, which is another name for marriage. And finally, Christians have only one spouse. This is called monotony. Okay, that finishes me. Does anybody have any comments or memories they want to share with us about things? Mr. Batts here remembers me as a boy. He says, I'm a cute little boy. I never stole his collars.
Well, what did you do with the collars once you stole them?
Oh, okay, that's good. No. Well,
Them up and down from it.
yeah, we'd go to somebody's house who didn't grow collars.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I remember one night we went to Mr. Posey Lanier's. Olamay didn't have a daughter, Olamay Lanier. And they all knew what we were up to, but he came out with his shotgun and shot up in the air. We thought he was shooting at us, and we ran for about miles. In another book I wrote about growing up in Wilmington, as a part of PE, we had to go over to the girls' gym and learn to dance. And dancing was something I just hated. And they always matched me up with a girl about a foot taller than me. Finally, I got up with a girl who was about my size. Actually, she was the only date I ever had in high school. We went to the senior prom. But I was telling her, I was trying to figure out what to talk about, so I was telling her about collar stealing. And she said, well, what is that all about? And I told her we'd steal collars. And she said, well, don't you have an A&P? They sell collars? I said, no, we got Van Bradham and Billy Brinkley and there's the linear store, and they sell collars. I said, well, why do you steal them? I couldn't answer that, it was just for the fun of it.
There's some tradition.
Anybody else have any memories they want to share as their child? Okay. I turn it over. I've got, if anybody wants to buy a book, $10. I got about 5 different books over there. They make pretty nice, cheap gifts. So, okay.
Well, thank you so much. It did bring back